Hello, this is Mr. Dr. Long, and this is English 3327, Masterpieces of British Literature, and I'm your instructor. It's been a while since I've had a video, and so today I'm gonna make a video on I'm calling it the neoclassical order and confidence, the confidence of the neoclassical period. And this is going to be a two-part video. I want to set up kind of the background, or make a case for the background for how neoclassical thinkers came to understand the universe the way they saw it, and how that affected almost everything: architecture, art, the way they viewed physics, the way they viewed the fundamental structure of the universe, and also the way they applied that to literature and art. And for this first part of the video, I'm going to take us up to the point at which we would begin applying some of these ideas to the poetry that we've been reading, Dryden, Pope, and those folks. So I would ask you that you would do the preliminary reading before you view this video, the selections from John Dryden and Alexander Pope in the syllabus, and also put a BBC documentary video up from the series of Civilization. And this video covers the 18th century Anglo-European cultures, entitled The Smile of Confidence. I believe that's what it's called. What we're concerned about is the conception of nature, and how the neoclassical age viewed the conception of nature. And if you'll recall, there were two kinds of nature presented as competing conceptions of nature in Shakespeare's King Lear. One of those was called the natural order. It was believed to be bestowed by God, or a divine natural order. Think about Hamlet in Shakespeare's other play, describing his mother and new stepfather as, quote, a little more than kin and a little less than kind. Here, Hamlet does mean they aren't very nice, but he also means, first, that their very fast marriage is less than natural. It's an unnatural act. And I refer to that as the theological definition of nature that Shakespeare presents in King Lear. The natural order in the theological definition determines human authority and subordination, social customs, and rituals and decorum. When Hamlet calls his mother less than kind, he means she is defying social custom for how a mother should act. We still use the term kind as related to a concept of nature when we say, I have a dog, and someone says, well, what kind of dog? What kind of dog is it? And we're not using kind to mean how nice someone is. We're using kind to mean, what is the nature of your dog? What is the specific nature of your dog? What's the breed of your dog? What kind of dog? The second definition of nature we can refer to as sort of the law of the jungle. It's a nature that's presented as disorder or chaos when we separate ourselves from divine order. I also call this the law of the jungle. Alfred North Tennyson, the poet, made a famous line. He referred to nature red in tooth and claw. Nature red in tooth and claw. Sort of the law of the jungle, a chaotic, competitive, violent kind of nature. When Edmund, the character in Act 1 of King Lear, has his soliloquy and he offers an invocation to nature. He says, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound." Edmund invokes the goddess of chaotic free will. And when he refers to custom later in the line, sort of derisively, he's referring to that theological nature. Custom as a weak version of human habit. He's defying and flouting that whole notion. Right. In the BBC documentary that I asked you to watch, and if you haven't watched that yet, I would invite you to stop the video and watch that. that documentary, because I'm going to be referring to some of the images in there and some of the ideas that are presented. It's episode 10, The Smile of Reason. And it shows us how radically things have shifted from the early 17th century when Shakespeare was writing, when Queen Elizabeth dies and King James takes the throne at the beginning of the 1600s, all the way to the early 18th century into the 1700s. The title of the episode is very clever, The Smile of Reason. The film shows a series of portrait paintings of famous European Renaissance men and women with smiles on their faces. And they're very interesting smiles. They're not smiles of happiness, what I think is intriguing about them. I interpret them as smiles of confidence. These are people who are smiling because they believe they have things figured out. They are confident. They are in the know. There's the smiles of the person who is holding a really good poker hand and knows he or she is about to win the hand. It's a smile of confidence. No one embodied that sort of confidence or generated that sense of confidence in Renaissance thinkers more than two people, Isaac Newton and John Locke. And their careers helped bring about this confidence, I'm going to argue. The first thing that happened that laid the foundation for these monumental thinkers, Isaac Newton and John Locke, was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther poked the first hole in the Catholic Church, the authority of the Catholic Church, and their universal monopoly on intellectual authority. Luther makes possible a whole range of religious and non-religious protests against established authority. And at the time, it just so happened that established authority was religious and it was centered around the Catholic Church. But Protestantism can be a protest against any kind of authority. Okay? The spirit of rebellion and inquiry that Protestantism made possible also allowed two other things to happen. Isaac Newton's career, John Locke's career. Both were geniuses, but more important, both chafed tremendously under the educational expectations that were imposed on them by the existing educational system at the time. They both went their own way. They both took unusual educational paths, went their own way, and developed whole systems of thought that completely separated themselves and European civilization from the past. Newton published the monumental work Principia Mathematica, and when he publishes that, he in effect mathematizes the universe of all physical objects. He showed how all the motion of those physical objects are governed and can be explained by consistent mathematical laws. The universe, as Newton presented it, resembled a watch that we keep time with, whose parts moved in a predictable, reliable relation to each other. Like Newton, Locke observed the world closely, and he decided that we come to knowledge, if we come to knowledge at all, or to whatever limit we come to knowledge at all, through observation. Locke's major work was called Essay Concerning Human Understanding. It changed the way people saw what a person is. Under Catholicism, all persons are souls who originate in God and with a potential to return to God. All souls are Christian in the sense that they're each born in a certain place, and as a soul occupying that place, your soul would be placed under the care of some official in the Catholic Church representing the authority of the Catholic Church. That priest in that whatever that parish was answered to a higher authority, the bishop, who answered to a higher authority, the Catholic cardinal, who answered to a higher authority, the Pope, and who was viewed as God's chosen successor to Christ on earth. the highest human authority on earth. The Pope, of course, answered to other divine intermediaries who connect all the way up to God. So it was a chain of command. It was very much a hierarchical universe, and it was a system that was maintained and kept in place. John Locke, explored the idea that a person begins as, in the Latin term, as a tabula rasa, as a blank tablet. You imagine like a wax tablet on which we might make marks on. And a person is a blank tablet that emerges as an accumulation of impressions made by the world, made by our experiences of the world on that blank slate. We still retain some of that language when we say, yeah, that's the speech I saw or that lecture I saw really made a strong impression upon me. You are using Lockean language. It really made a strong impression on me. A person for Locke, then, can be determined by their environment and their education. And more radically, a person might very well be someone who determines his or her own education and environment. If you choose to be in a different environment, if you choose a different kind of education or educational approach, or you choose to listen to different authorities, you have the power of becoming a different kind of person, according to Locke. Who you are is not predetermined by some divine authority. What Newton and Locke do, in effect, is reconcile those two competing conceptions of nature that you saw vying with each other in Shakespeare's King Lear. You have the natural order, or the natural hierarchy bestowed by God, comes to be seen as an order shared by all inanimate objects as well. If the behavior of planets, moons, and apples falling from a tree obey consistent, comprehensible laws, then maybe human behavior might as well. Maybe there's a chance we can figure everything out, including behavior. The movement of objects may be the easy part. How we predict and anticipate and understand human behavior may be a little more difficult. But Locke was taking that on. Okay. This progression through Newton and Locke is one explanation for how Anglo-European culture arrived at this very peculiar notion of neoclassical notion of nature, with a capital N. And if you look in your Norton Anthology on page 2195 in the 9th edition, volume 9, there are two paragraphs that attempt to explain what nature is from this neoclassical conception. And I'm going to read here. Nature as the universal and permanent elements in human experience. Nature as the universal and permanent elements in human experience. Nature, according to the neoclassical view, is filtered through and derived by human experience. External nature, what we see out in the world, plants, birds, insects, hurricanes, etc. The landscape attracted attention throughout the 18th century as a source of pleasure and an object of inquiry. But as Finch muses on the landscape in A Nocturnal Reverie, it is her own soul she discovers. Alexander Pope's injunction to the critic, first follow nature, has primarily human nature in view, not that external nature. Nature consists of the enduring general truths that have been, are, and will be true for everyone in all times, everywhere. Hence, the business of the poet, according to Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, is, quote, to examine not the individual, but the species, to remark general properties and large appearances, to exhibit in his portraits of nature such prominent and striking features as recall the original to every mind. So there's this neoclassical notion of nature. First, it assumes there's something consistent about nature over time. There's something consistent about human nature over time that ties us all together as a species. We don't change as a species, we stay the same, and we share common features throughout time that we could observe, explain, and understand. Okay. The second paragraph in the Norton Anthology goes like this: to study nature was also to study the ancients, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Nature and Homer, according to Pope, were the same. And both Pope and his readers applied Horace's satires on Rome to their own world, because Horace had expressed the perennial forms of life. Moreover, modern writers could learn from the ancients how to practice their craft. If a poem is an object to be made, the poet, a word derived from the Greek for maker, poiesis, must make the object to proper specifications. Thus, poets were taught to plan their works in one of the classical kinds or genres: epic, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, satire, or ode, to choose a language appropriate to that genre and to select the right style and tone and rhetorical figures. The rules of art, as Pope had said, are nature methodized. Very famous line from Pope. At the same time, however, writers needed wit, quickness of mind, inventiveness, a knack for conceiving images and metaphors, and for perceiving resemblances between things apparently unlike. So wit was a part of human nature. I'm going to now attempt to explain how this neoclassical or Augustan age might have arrived at this very unusual conception of nature. And I'm going to argue that the 18th century thinkers arrived at their conception of nature by synthesizing those two other competing definitions that Shakespeare pits against each other in King Lear. So, step one: what happens in history to bring this conception of nature up to the 17th century? Step one: what collectors, people who were wealthy, made money in shipping trade. A lot of them were from Italy. There were collectors who searched for Greek and Latin manuscripts that had been stored in monasteries. This became very popular. They wanted to try to retrieve as much of that old classical culture as they could. They gathered these manuscripts, they translated them into their languages, they reintroduced them to the intelligentsia in the translation, in a vernacular translation that people could read. When you combine movable type printing presses with this massive translation of these classical texts into vernacular languages, what you have is a much wider number of readers who are being introduced to these very powerful classical writers like Plato and Aristotle. Most of the works of both Plato and Aristotle have been lost for over 1,000 years and were recovered and translated into vernacular languages. It's not just philosophy, there's science as well, and also literature. At the end of Elizabeth's reign, towards the end of her reign, more and more people were reading and translating Greek and Roman plays. The modern opera, a multi-sensory spectacle involving a stage and stage actors and singers, but also a musical score, a libretto, was first invented as we know it in the year 1600. And it was invented, modern opera was invented as an attempt to recreate the effect that modern Europeans thought would have been invoked by a Greek tragedy like Oedipus the King, or something like this, or by Sophocles. After Dryden translates Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, an increasing number of these new translations of Plato and Aristotle are appearing in English. These new Renaissance thinkers begin wondering what else the Greeks and Romans might have originated that could be uncovered, that could be rediscovered, right? There began to be the suspicion that intelligent people or intelligent civilization had lost a great deal of knowledge that could be recovered and had been forgotten and could be remembered again. And one idea from the classical age came storming back, especially in the late 1600s and early 1700s, and that was the Greek idea of symmetry, where you have a balance between two things side by side. Symmetry. The Greek thinker Pythagoras had shown that mathematical symmetry could be found in many unexpected places. For example, he noticed that musical notes in different octaves connected to a proportional mass of the thing vibrating the notes. Okay, so if you have a guitar string that plays a certain note, if you play that guitar string and you cut the mass of that guitar string exactly in half and you pluck that string, it's going to create a note that's exactly one octave higher. It's the same note one octave higher than the original note. And if you create a string that's double the mass of your original string and you pluck that one, it's going to be the same note one octave lower. And the Greeks noticed this. Well, this is a very surprising idea. What it does is connects mass, the physical world, to a very intriguing proportional, like a proportional number. It mathematizes the way things sound and connects it, that mathematics connects the way things sound to physical mass in objects out here in the world. Right. I've put a diagram on the script that I'm reading from that shows the vibrations of strings, and it's proportional. One note is exactly twice as large. The vibrating wave is exactly half the size of the original wave, and then the note that's one octave higher than that is exactly twice as or half the size of the note that's one octave lower. And you see that model, right? In the model, notes 1, 2, and 4 are the same note, but each note is 1 or 2 octaves higher or lower than the others, right? Pythagoras, a Greek thinker, figured this out, and in doing so, he connected the worlds of physical mass, musical sound, and mathematical order. Greek thinkers assumed that if music derived from physical objects in a perfectly symmetrical way, like music theory showed us, then everything else must as well, right? Principle of analogy. Therefore, the new Renaissance natural philosophers, or what we called scientists at that time, who attempted to discover the fundamental components of matter and their connection to the larger cosmos, borrowed assumptions from their Greek predecessors. So if the universe consisted of 8 perfect concentric spheres encasing the earth at the center, with heaven serving as this ninth sphere on the outside edge, that must be what the universe is like. We call this the Ptolemaic universe, and it's where we get the common phrase, the music of the spheres. Music connected to this perfect universe. 8 spheres connects to the eighth 8 notes in a musical octave. We have to have it that way. I've brought us up to the point where we can begin connecting this idea of symmetry to literature. And I'm going to do that in part 2 of this video. And so I would strongly recommend that you watch the next video in this series. I appreciate your patience and your willingness to watch this video, and I hope it was helpful. So I hope you have a good evening, and please watch the next video, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you.